This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ or sign up for our email list to stay up to date on everything we have going on. And to get the most involved, join our free Mighty Networks community to get connected with others living this restorative justice life all over the world. As far as this podcast goes, make sure you're subscribed, leave a rating and review, and share with a friend to help us further amplify this work. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives. Jenny, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
I am a white woman with gray hair.
Who are you?
I am a mom of 3 children I birthed and 2 more who've joined our family.
Who are you?
I am a dog mom of a pup named Shay.
Who are you?
I am a circle keeper.
Who are you?
I am a tent camper.
Who are you?
I am a transplanted Northwoods girl.
Finally, who are you?
I am now a city girl who lives in the north side of Chicago.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Jenny. Very excited to have this conversation, which we'll get back to in just a moment.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and today we are welcoming Jenny Viets to the podcast. Jenny is a restorative justice practitioner in both community and Chicago public schools. With an emphasis on using the arts to reach, teach, and heal, she has worked as a multi-disciplinary teaching artist and arts administrator for children and families for the past 30 years. This episode is so important because she touches on her artistry as well as her extensive restorative justice training. Without further ado, let's get back into it.
Welcome back, Jenny. I'm so excited to have you here for many reasons, some that I shared with you. But, I don't know if you know this, but outside of my circle training with Aura Shub, you were at the second circle that I ever attended in the basement of the Rogers Park United Methodist Church at the Rogers Park Community Circle in Chicago. And so you've been with me, whether you knew it or not, like on this journey from almost day one. And so I'm very excited to be having this conversation with you. We've worked together over the past couple years in other capacities we're going to get into in a moment. But just wanted to share my excitement with the audience and you. It's always good to check in at the beginning of these conversations. So to the fullest extent that you want to answer the question right now, how are you?
I'm good. It's a new, a new road for me right now, because for the first time since the 80s really, when I was working at the Children's Hospital, I have a full-time job. First time. And a desk. And for me, the other cool thing is, since the 80s, since I graduated from college in 82, it has been a journey and a path that sometimes I fought against, but fell into, was dragged into, lovingly walked into. So I feel it's all connected way back to the beginning. Yeah.
For those of you who aren't watching this, which is everybody, Jenny was drawing a circle as she was talking through that, and I was reminded very early on, one of the things you didn't say in your Who Are You is that you're an artist, and you bring that into your circle keeping, and an activity that you had us do. I don't know if it was in that first community circle, but in a subsequent community circle that I was a part of was, I don't even remember what the prompt was. I just remember the piece of art that I produced about something around the circle of life, and I had drawn my circle in different colors representing different stages of my life and leaving some space blank. It's actually like, I still have it. It's actually in a room over
Oh
there
my
in my
gosh.
house, and I'm just really tickled by, like, the full circleness of this moment
Mm.
for reasons that you've mentioned, and so many others. You've been doing this work in restorative justice, or quote unquote restorative justice, for a long time, probably before you even knew the words.
Mhm.
So how did this work get started for you?
Well, I'm old, so the story might be longer than with some other people. Yeah, and I think really, when I think about restorative justice work before there were words for it, I think about being in relationship with people and being in deep personal right relationship with people. And that really started when I started volunteering at Children's Memorial Hospital, which is now Lurie's here in Chicago, and then ended up getting on staff. I have been at the cusp, at the beginning of three completely new fields throughout my career. And the first one was child life, which didn't exist. It was a new field when I was doing the work, which is the psychosocial needs of children in hospitals. And I was mentored by somebody who had come to Chicago 25 years before I had, as a world renowned concert pianist, did the same thing. She was an artist. I was a theater person, that's my degree. She was a pianist, and she started volunteering in the hospital and was one of the founders, Mirta Perez of Child Life. And she loved me because I was this person bringing the arts to my work with the children. And I ended up grandparenting into the child life field, and while I had a theater degree, was doing child life work. And I became the adolescent specialist and was leading support groups for the teenagers who not only, and this will come back again later on, not only were patients themselves, but who were teenagers who had infants who were patients at the hospital. And we would
Mm.
gather and make art and plant and sing and write and be in deep relationship with one another through some very difficult times. And I still maintain relationships with some of the young people who were teenage patients at the hospital. And that work led me to the second field, which is now called teaching artist, which didn't exist. There was no word for us, and teaching artists often started in hospitals. I formed a not for profit theater company in the hospital. I started over the course of 2 decades teaching med students and medical residents how to use the arts as a part of the healing process. And whenever we did groups with the coursework for the students, it was at the Rehabilitation Institute in circle with patients and their family members and the med students. And we'd ask the med students to take off their white coats because the circle wasn't enough to decrease that hierarchy of identity with everyone. And then ultimately the third field, right? Fairly new field of restorative justice. But I'm going to tell you what, where my circle more closely identified came to was in Al-Anon. I became a member of Al-Anon and in 95 and stayed in that circle room for 10 years where somebody had a lead and would speak and the rest of us would listen. And you didn't use a talking piece, and there wasn't a circle keeper who was holding space in the way I think of it now, but it's where I really learned to listen. And somebody I was in circle with recently used the word become an empathy midwife. I love that idea of helping to bring empathy into a space. Yeah, so then I started to I was volunteering in my own children's classrooms, doing theater as a drama teacher, but I knew those kids needed to check in. And so I started doing circle as a part of my theater work. And from that point on, everything just all mushed up together. And I'm mushing up my hands right now and squishing them all together.
Yeah, there's, I told you from the beginning, this could be like a 3, 4, 5 hour conversation. We're not going to do that to you listeners, although, there might be a return conversation in the future. But I am struck by, the being at the genesis or near the early beginnings of all these different human centered, I'll call them quote unquote professions,
Mm.
right? Caring for children, like why is that a profession?
Mm.
Teaching art, okay, we can call that a profession, but like practicing restorative justice, like no, this is just like what you were saying, like how we are human together, how are we are in right relationship. There are lots of people who have been innovators, quote unquote, on the cusp of new fields, but the ones that you've chosen, or the ones that chose you, were really about being being with people in a good way. Where did that ethic come from?
Oh gosh, gosh. I grew up in a small town, a small white Lutheran town, in northern Wisconsin, and I pre-internet. I didn't know that the world. I'll tell you when I knew the world was broad and wide was when Richard Nixon went to China and it was on television 24/7, and I could see this other country and think about this other world, and had really opportunities to experience other cultures and peoples that looked different from me, and that I loved and appreciated. I got to do Chinese opera theater with a friend whose father was teaching at the university. They'd come from China, and Chen was my friend and brought me into this dance in eighth grade. And so there was just an opportunity to think the world is big and wide, and I want to see more of it, and I want to be a part of it. And so I don't know, that idea of wanting to learn more and listen and use my gifts. That was it. I'd been told, maybe that's it. I'd been told I had gifts, right? I was dramatic. I was a great songwriter. I was a great listener. People told me that and fostered that in me. And when I was feeling insecure, being on stage helped me feel like I belonged. And so I knew what it felt like to not be in spaces where I belonged. And I knew how to provide opportunities to allow other people to feel like they did. And I had this modality, I had this art making modality, which has stayed with me through today, that I think the way in is through song, is through poetry, is through art making, is through movement, is through combining that with opportunities to share our words as well. So all of the art making is what, and when I say art making, I mean all of it. I mean, when I was solely calling myself a teaching artist, people would still try to pigeonhole me and say, well, she's the music teacher. And I'd be like, no, 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 I'm the drama teacher. Well, no, okay, I'll be the music. People wanted me to be this one thing, and I was never being the one thing because everybody I was working with. And I will also say, there's a lot of other things I've done, but also included working in sheltered work sites, creating arts camps for children in residential treatment centers, with women in battered women shelters. And that phrase isn't even accurate anymore that we're using. But, and so it's how am I going to find a way, often for even through the visual art making, for us just to be quiet and make something and then ask a question and create this. And in the work group, in the support groups at the hospital, what are we doing with our hands to make us feel comfortable enough to share from our hearts? And so while at first I centered the art making and the questions came in, the relationship building came in. Later on, I was centering the relationship building, and the art making came in, and that's now kind of how my circle practice works. Is finding a way that all of it is there. Yeah, laying the groundwork for deep listening.
Yeah, you had talked about, or you'd briefly mentioned, like the theater is one of the places where you like kind of first felt that sense of belonging. Was there a specific moment that you're thinking about, or something Yeah.
Sure. It was middle school. I got cast
Yeah.
in, Tom Sawyer. I was Aunt Polly. I could sing you the song that I sang on stage, in that musical. I mean, it had a big impact on me, and it had an impact on the friendships that I developed. And actually, the friendships, even then, there's very few friendships that I've maintained from um, middle school, high school, but the friendships I still do have are the people I was in shows with. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about something else that you said about, the gifts that you had were identified, cultivated, you were celebrated for them. When we think about, the seven core assumptions of restorative
Mhm.
justice, all humans have gifts and everyone
Needed for
is
what
needed
they
for what
bring.
they bring in, you know, in different spaces, right? Um, you in your work over the years, highlighting your gifts, and using them to invite people into these spaces of belonging has been, one, a gift for me, and I know so many others, and will continue to be as we, excuse me, continue to do work, in restorative justice in schools, in community. But that is in opposition to a lot of the way that the world works. I'm curious if there's a moment of tension early on that you can think of, where either centering art or centering humans in a relationship came in tension with the power structures that you were working
It's never
within.
stopped. It's never stopped. Who was I coming up against in the hospital? Who were child life specialists who didn't even have that title coming up against to say that play was going to help in the healing of the children and families? The doctors and the people who owned the hospitals didn't want to recognize the importance of that work or the value of that work, and so as it became more specialized and accepted, now it's an accepted field. It wasn't at the time. It has taken 25, 30 years of scientists doing studies to do what we knew then, that singing and movement would help people in hospitals regain some memory, regain some movement, all of the therapy ideas that we knew were true at the time. But here's the other connection, David. Like, I was also up against music therapists, drama therapists, art therapists who had a certification and a specialization that had been accredited and that you could bill for. And here, us teaching artists who were called outreach artists, who were called community outreach workers, all kinds of names for us that they didn't have, were saying, yeah, but we just think that doing this, just to be in relationship with one another, to improve one another's quality of life, is as valid. And so there was that tension too. Then later on, right? So that comes up all the time too, about who's qualified to do the work and what does the work look like and sound like, and is outcome my goal? Am I trying to have an outcome for this? Am I setting goals for each circle and writing down my objectives and my goals and then doing a pre and a post test to see whether or not I've achieved them? No, but there are people who would have you do that, to write a grant, to get the funding, whatever. And so there's always been tension with people who held the power and still hold the power, trying to tell you what is valid and what is. People would take issue with my tagline at the time, which still is a tagline: to reach, teach, and heal. And there's people who don't like that.
Yeah. What are some of the ways? I mean, other than like persistence, continuing to show up and doing what you know is right, but like, what are some of the strategies, words that you've said to people to help them see or invite them into, this
Yeah,
different
same way I
way
do
of
now,
seeing
which
things?
is I can tell you about it all I want, but I want you to come and be with me and be in the space with me and participate. The other thing I would do, and this comes back again to at the hospital, is rather than a pre and a post test, we would invite the med students to have a journal throughout our 7 week course, in which they danced and drummed and clowned and sang, and And their journal drawings and poetry and journal writings that they gave us permission to use were all the documentation and proof we needed that people were being impacted by doing the work. And so I often still do invite people to keep a journal through a process and share out what they've learned. Or here's something, maybe you do this, but I learned a long time ago from a mentor, Bob Alexander, in Living Stage Theater Company in Washington, D.C. You ask people to write you love letters, and you use those words. You say, write me a love letter. And boy, oh boy, when people have permission to write a love letter, they do. And it serves as being something that lifts me when my spirits are low, and also can serve as some kind of documentation that what you're doing is important.
Yes, I'm thinking about um, the very like sneaky, arguably manipulative way I think about this, like in trainings, right? Like, hey, in the reflection form, in order to get your certificate of completion, heavy quote unquote, like you have to talk about, what you've appreciated, what you've learned, like what is different, and then like scrape those things like, here's the data, these are the quote unquote testimonials, here's the proof of the impact that this is having on people. I also appreciate the shade at, well, shade and appreciation. You can hold two things at once, right? At people who have been certified and licensed to do things like music therapy, art therapy, also certificates in restorative justice, restorative practices, all these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no one right way of learning these things. There's a right way of learning these things, but there is a there are so many ways that this work has come to be. There's so many ways that people have come into this work. There's so many ways that this work can be affected. And I'm not saying that the licensed and certified people
Absolutely.
aren't doing
And I
good
think
work,
there's a place for
right?
all of us. And the testimony to that is all these years later, however many, 30, 40, yeah, I guess 40 years later, now arts and medicine departments, have teaching artists and art therapists working together. And that's what we should all be striving for. We all need to learn and want to do our work in different kinds of ways. And so I think there are ways for us to be in relationship.
This might be skipping a step, but what does that mean for quote unquote certified restorative justice practitioners and people who just know this as a life way?
Well, I came to this work as a parent. I came to this work as somebody whose teenage children, a teenage son, was involved in the work when he was 13, 14 years old. I didn't come to it. And honestly, I remember being at a Precious Blood fundraiser luncheon that my son had invited me as his plus one to come to the luncheon. And I'd been doing all these variations on the work, but not like, and I was sitting in his circles at the time. They did when he was at Circles and Ciphers, he and another young man started a book club circle on the new Jim Crow and then $40 Million Slave. And I sat in on those circles and I loved them. And so when we were at the luncheon, I'm like, can you introduce me to those people who like circle trained you? And he's like, yeah. So he introduced me. And then I went through the formal training with Aura Shub, who many people in Chicago know. But we were all doing the work, right? And no one ever gave me a credentials, but I've been in a lot of spaces where people have said, I did this and I went here and I've got this degree, and that's cool, but credentials have never been who I was. I don't know, now I'm rambling, but I think if people have learned something by doing that and are helping others, lift others up who don't have that same privilege or opportunity for any number of reasons. But hopefully what we'll talk about here today is all the people I know in town who've never done any of that and are doing really amazing, phenomenal work in community. And so I want to keep fostering them. And as part of my work as a white woman, right, I also want to keep finding opportunities for young younger Black people of color to be the ones primarily doing the work.
Yeah. Yeah. Not your son, Ethan, but Ethan Ucker, of Circles and Ciphers. And I, maybe in like those early days when we were in community circle together, I was asking him, coming from a non, like, how can I be employed in the nonprofit way of doing this work, right? And the question that he came back to me with was like, well, why aren't we trying to provide these kind of opportunities for other young people of color, these kids who know this work already by having participated in it for so long, and you coming in talking to me with your graduate school in social justice kind of deal, is that the thing that's most applicable to this community? Like that, good point. And speaking not as a white person, right, but speaking from an outsider to that community, right? Somebody who's came in with like a more professional lens to it. It's like that was a very early check on myself, and been very appreciative of that and appreciative of your orientation towards it. I'm curious, when you were talking about that first interaction with a quote unquote formal training process in Circle, and like I kind of laugh about that as like a formal process, because yes, you did go through a 4-day training, and there are a lot more formalized ways that restorative justice training happens, where there's degree programs and all that. How did that resonate and bolster the practices that you had embodied already, as far as a teaching artist and a child life person?
I think again, it gave me another experience in listening. But I'm going to tell you that the thing about that particular 4-day training is that it happened 2 weeks after my mother died. And so I was grieving. I was so deep in my grief, and I had 4 days to sit in circle and cry and be a part of things and build relationships with people. Can I tell you a story? So one of the things, of course I can, but one of the things, one of the things
This
that
is a
happened
podcast.
is that in that space, one of the people who was in the space with me was not from here. She was from Buffalo. But she happened to be in Philadelphia. I think they were in Philadelphia when a BYP 100 conference was happening, and my son was at the conference. Everybody poured out after the conference. There was police in the street who were trying to arrest an adolescent. The people from the conference decided to de-arrest him. There was a confrontation. The police started pepper spraying people. My son was pepper sprayed. The person who was in circle with me here in Chicago recognized him from our opportunities to be in space together, and she is the one who poured milk into his eyes and helped him at that space. Had we not, so this is like these deep connections about relationships and how these opportunities to be in circle with one another end up showing up in lots of different ways around the country and around the world. And so what we're always trying to do, for me in circle, when I'm doing circle and community particularly, is create these relationships. So when I walk outside that space and I'm in the street, I say hello to neighbors and to people and everybody, but I know these folks differently. And that is going to shift and change what happens outside, right? We're practicing in circle. We're practicing our values and our guidelines and the way we want to be out in the world. So when we have all these little opportunities and moments to do that, it all comes back around again. And that has happened to me. I could tell you a lot of different stories about connections to people who I've sat in circle with that ended up being very deep and meaningful in ways I would have never expected.
Yeah, and I think also about a phrase that you used earlier. Oh shoot, I'm gonna butcher the phrase. I think like a
Yeah,
midwife for
empathy
empathy,
midwife. Yeah, yeah.
empathy midwife, right? I'm thinking about times that I've been in circle that have been so resonant for me. Just the idea of as you see people on the street, you might not have checked in with them, but you have this when you've sat in circle as long as we have, you always know that there's something going on
Hmm.
for everybody, right? Maybe that person's dealing with chronic illness. Maybe that person is grieving the loss of a loved one. Maybe that person has a newborn at home and is not getting very much sleep. Maybe that person is struggling with addiction. Maybe that everybody's got something going on underneath the surface. And having that orientation towards empathy for others, even if you're not personally very connected to that person, allows you to treat people a little bit differently, with a little bit more grace, a little bit more kindness, and not saying that people who are causing you harm in any given circumstance, when they're pepper spraying you or for example, should be the benefactors of that kind of grace and respect. Like you just got to do what you got to do to survive in those moments. But after the fact, hey, what was there are opportunities for repair when you see like the person underneath all those things. I'm curious, you went from experiencing circle practice in from your children, moving into a more formal like community, um, and I say formal loosely. There was a community circle that you participated in, with on with Elise, edit this out. There was a community circle that you participated in, with routine, and your practice continued to grow. You continue to do this work in lots of different spaces. The other point of our intersection was when we were both doing this work in Chicago public schools. What made you want to do that work, in systems where, that in so many instances run counter to the work
Yeah.
that we're trying to do?
Well, you know, um, I'd worked in schools as a teaching artist in different
Mm-hmm.
capacities, I was always working with young people. I worked with Free Street Theater for many years, in its first iteration, second iteration actually, years ago here, and that was creating pieces of theater with youth. And the theater pieces were their words. They would perform, they would write it, and I was just helping to facilitate that work. I worked with pregnant and parenting teenagers, you doing writing workshops at two Chicago public schools when they were segregated, and I ran that community circle for about 5 years. Once the young people said, you know what, this has served our course, we're going to go to something else, and kind of turned it over. Um, and um, and so the school thing was always a part of my work, and I didn't have language to call it harm reduction at the time, but when I was coming in to school rooms, I knew that I was providing respite in really beautiful ways because, again, as a teaching artist, I wasn't there as a teacher. I didn't have to grade them, I didn't have to worry, but we were there to lift one another up and to have joyful experiences and to build relationships with one another, often through speaking and writing. And so when someone approached me about an open part-time position as a restorative practices coach for the district, I applied and I got that job, and had to learn a lot. What benefited me was my years of experience working with pre-K through 12th grade, working with people with physical and mental disabilities, of working in contained special education classrooms, of finding ways to be inclusive, and of doing circle work that CPS, when my kids were in school, was just starting to pay lip service to. I was fighting for things that CPS hadn't fully embraced yet when my kids were little, and I didn't have community to do it. I felt pretty alone at the time when all the horrific things were happening to other kids at our school. So for me, that bench represented a punitive response that was race based, and was and I experienced it as a parent. And not even for my own kids, for other kids who were in that school. And I knew it was harmful, and I knew it was wrong, and I knew there were other ways, but I certainly didn't have RJ language at the time. Or be able to say, here, why don't you do this? I would be able to say, here, why don't we do this? But it was coming from all my other backgrounds, So, yeah, that allowed me a different kind of view. And because of my, wherever I think I was more able to do the work and be somewhat successful at it, as successful as we can be, in working with administrators, working with teachers, and working definitely with the students, and working with very young students who even most RJ people are still not doing.
Yeah, well, I'm curious like what all of that looked like. I often talk about how it's easier to do this work with students, just in general. And so I'm curious what that looked like for you in your work doing that. We can start with the younger ones, move on up, but also curious about how you approached adults who were maybe not as open to doing this kind of work in their jobs that they'd been doing a certain way for a very long time.
Right. So
let's start with students.
I felt very,
that's
very
easy
comfortable with students of all ages, and I would be assigned to 2 schools for a semester, sometimes for a year, and then I would have there be about 3 or 4 teachers, 4 at the most, who I would mentor. And how I would mentor them was creating circles for their classroom, weekly circles that they would participate in until finally there was gradual release, and then they'd be leading them. But the kids, loved it so much. And talk about testimonials. How did I know I was doing well? It was when it was time for me to leave, and I'd get the bookmarks and the beautiful giant puzzle and the cards and the things that the students would say. Thank you so much for doing circle with us. Or when I'd be in the hallways and kids would see me and be like, are we doing circle today? So I was completely associated with circle. Like that is who I was. That was what I was bringing, and that was something that they wanted. Not all the kids did. I didn't have time to be in relationship with them as much as I might have if I were embedded in the building 5 days a week and was on staff there. But I knew that they would come to it if their teachers persisted. And so that idea of persistence and keeping at it no matter what, and having a team of people who you could rely on in a building and who were your allies when there were teachers who weren't. Because again, remember going back to my work in the hospital with doctors who just thought what we were doing was ridiculous, and that's not the way it's done. And theater people who didn't think teaching artists had any value to them, and that was just a cute little thing you did while you were on your way to doing the real thing you were meant here to do. And the same with RJ work. There are still people out there who are going to say, this is an important work, and I'm on my journey about how to deal with them. And so right now, Jean Klasowski, who you know, and Jean is the person who hired me into that job. She has since lived to her position and is doing PhD work. But her and I are meeting bi-weekly just to talk about what's the science behind getting someone to shift their mindset. What's the science behind it? We're talking real deep, reading lots of things, because I'm always going one step back, one step back, one step back. How am I going to reach them in a country where 17 states still allow children to be hit in schools? 17 states. And here in Illinois, private schools still allow, by the law says private school teachers can still hit children in schools, when 42 to 50%, 56% of all races of people in the United States still spank their children, despite the American Academy of Pediatrics 6 years ago putting out the most definitive research there is about how harmful that is. So shifting our country's mindset from a punitive to a restorative mindset, when we have the largest number of incarcerated people in the world, all of that, it's all part and parcel. And so, oh, you do what you can with what you have, and sustaining things. I feel much more confident in young people sustaining the work than I do in the adults who are unsupported in a school building.
Can you say more on
Sure.
that last piece?
So, you know, the people who are doing the science, right, say that it takes 3 to 5 years for restorative practices to really get a hold on things. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and right now is a hard time to talk about the work, particularly. I know you've had people on your podcast who have been writing about that and talking about COVID and how that's impacting everybody's regressed. So people who may have had a restorative mindset are now 5 steps back. Yep. That
Survival
kids
mode.
are
Mm-hmm.
in reaction mode rather than being in relationship with one another. Nobody feels like they have time to do this work anymore. Time is a huge factor. But it's hard to be out there alone. It's hard to be the only teacher in a building who's doing it. It's hard not to have colleagues who you can talk to and rely on and share skills with, and go for more education with. Um, and so how and for me, the component that has always been left off are the caregivers in a building. When are y'all going to bring them in? Like, there are some people doing it, but how are we involving the whole school community? What does it even mean to identify as school community? Um, yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how
Hmm.
the framework of harm reduction
It is.
um, is so helpful, right? It's helpful in releasing yourself from changing everything, saving the world, like not necessarily having a savior mindset, but also like the burden of I can fix this. Um, this is so deep, deeply entrenched in who we are as a country, right? This punitive way of being. We've talked on this podcast a handful of times about, what you're talking about, like spanking, hitting kids, right? Where did that come from, right? Where did these punitive ways of controlling people's behavior, or attempting to control people's behavior, come from? Subjugating indigenous people, controlling people who were enslaved, Africans, right? And those things were passed down through generations about like how to control. And in some ways that's been codified as, we keep you safe. We teach you to act right by doing this. And that's generations and generations and generations of undoing, not even just like a
Mm-hmm.
3 to 5 year process, right? We can have this beautiful training experience where you're like, oh, that's right. Oh my gosh, I can think about these things differently. But what's going to happen the next time you have a student who you're at ops with, right? It might not be a spanking, right? It might not be a whooping. It might not be that, but it might be detention. It might be go to the office. It might be go out in the hall. You might not have the capacity, the wherewithal in the moment to, take that breath for yourself, and maybe even like stop the class and be like, hey, this is something that's happening here. We're a community who cares about each other. We had these agreements. Let's circle up and talk about what's going on right now. That's a big jump to ask somebody to do. And, the model that you talked about, right, where you're embedded in a school, maybe 2 or 3 days a week working with a small group of teachers, right, is something that I also participated in as a restorative practices coach, within Chicago Public Schools with another organization as well.
Mm-hmm.
There are just limits to that.
Mm-hmm.
Harm reductive for sure. Like I still have relationships
Same.
with some of
Mm-hmm.
the teachers that I've worked with, and we've continued to talk about like what does this look like even as administrations change, and we have not necessarily made the progress that we visioned for like quote unquote whole school implementation. um, I find hope in that harm reduction in the ways that we've continued to make inroads. And like when you zoom out, like you were saying, it's like, fuck, like there's still so much to do, so much to undo. You've stepped now into a more full-time role, like you said. You're not part-time anymore. You're doing this full-time. What does that entail, and how's that been going?
Well, I have a very fancy title now. The title is
Ooh, lay it
Alternative
on us.
Resolution Pathways Specialist.
Ooh.
Yeah, sometimes I think about, when I'm in my non-restorative mind of going back into buildings that I was in when I was a parent and horrific things were happening and no one would listen to me. And I come back in with my badge, with my ID, and now I have a little bit more power for you to listen to me. Um, I'm working in the Office of Student Protections and EOCO. And so it's kind of, yeah, Equal
Sorry, EOCO.
Opportunities uh, Commission. So both of these
Gotcha.
offices were formed because of the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights, determining that there was a lot of harm happening in schools and there needed to be more done to stop the harm from happening. And so the position that I'm in, from what I am gathering and learning more about, doesn't really exist in K-12 schools. It exists in colleges. And it's when sexual harm of any nature happens between students, between two adults, between the harm happening with the student causing harm to an adult. Title IX government, the law says that they can be offered an informal resolution response, which means a restorative solution. And at the college level, they're usually calling it restorative practices. They initially were calling it mediation, but mediation is doesn't work for these kinds of processes because mediation implies that there's some kind of equal balance between the two parties coming in. So, and the EOCO issues are for race-based harm and for gender-based harm and gender expression, any of the protected categories under the Department of Civil Rights. So anyway, for the first time ever, and I'm still helping to create it and build it, is create a restorative path should the person harmed choose it. So there's a whole lot of law that goes into that and nuance about whether it's the best approach. And for me, also just thinking about, do I personally believe that the way it works now, which is there's an investigation and then there's a decision maker who makes a decision about whether it's a valid case or not. And then if it's not, if they say no, there's not enough proof to prove this happened or in this way, it doesn't meet our guidelines, that's that. And so having people at any point in the process choose a restorative path is the goal that we're looking for, but trying to be very careful about building that out. But I'm on the training and prevention team. So we're also trying to do prevention work by doing anti-bias work with young people, civil rights scholars, high school kids coming in for the whole year, meeting once a month, doing circle with them once a month and working with them on understanding more, hearing their stories, and giving them seeds to go back to their own buildings to prevent it from happening in the first place. It's a mo.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much in there. I appreciate you highlighting for sure that like people who want to engage in this process, right? We're not forcing people into doing this. I'm thinking I think this is anonymous enough, of a friend who at their school has a student who was raped by another student, and the school not having a
Right.
punitive or restorative process in place, right? And like the need for,
Yes.
in some ways, both in this harm reductive way, like in some ways, both for somebody to opt into, like, hey, one, this was against the law, but like more importantly, like I was harmed and it's not being acknowledged by anyone in any way, shape, or form. Like we need to do something, is super important. And if they don't want to step into a restorative process for that,
Right. And with harm that great, I mean, I would be quite honest and say that that wouldn't be an initial offering that, unless, because you have to be very careful that someone who's at their most vulnerable isn't being coerced into something. I also need to name that we're still doing this within a big hierarchical structure that is a big school district. And so always just being cognizant of that as well, you know. Yeah.
right? The ways that you at like the central office of Chicago Public Schools, like are asking people to engage, like doesn't necessarily reach all the way down to individual school level. CPS is a very big place. And even though quote unquote restorative practices have been a part of CPS for years and years and years now, it's a big place, and quote unquote implementation is in varying degrees of
Right.
engagement in
Right.
different spaces
And also
across the
naming
district.
that there's, you know, there's mandated things that everybody's supposed to be doing and reporting. And even I want to name, like, it's only been since last summer that having to report in a different way, identity based harm, protected category harm, that just happened
Mhm.
last summer. So it's shift. So here's the tricky part. The tricky part is naming that that kind of harm is more than you pushed me down on the playground. If you push me down on the playground and called
Right.
me a racial slur, that is a different, that's a different thing and needs to be identified as such
Mhm.
and handled as such. But we have to make sure, because we're elevating it into a different kind of harm, that we're not creating more punishment, but creating more opportunities for learning, for growing, um, um, for for understanding why that was so harmful in the first place. And most importantly for me, two things, those last two restorative questions, right? How are we going to prevent this from happening again as a community, right? And how are we going to repair the harm?
Mhm.
So number five, what needs to happen to make this right? But number six, people leave that one off, David. It's the most important thing to me in schools and in outside of schools. How are we going to prevent it from happening again? How are we complicit? How are we going to take personal responsibility for some components of this repair? And what was in our system? What was in this community that allowed it to happen in the first place?
Yeah. I love that you're highlighting that, and some folks who might have an orientation towards transformative justice rather than restorative justice would raise that as a critique. And thank you for raising that in the space where we're calling restorative justice. Again, fully acknowledging that like we're talking about being in right relationship. Whatever words you need to use to get there, I'm cool with. But it is more than just the two people who are impacted, who have responsibilities to each other and to the community. We as a community of impacted people, but also of supporters of people who cause harm and have been harmed, like have responsibilities, have obligations as well.
Absolutely. And so, I think I veered off from your original question, but I can go back and say, still, even though I'm doing this full time job, I asked when I got it, can I still please go to one of the preschools I've been at for a long time? So Tuesday afternoons, I still go
Mm.
to see toddlers and twos and 3 and 4 year olds to sing and tell stories from an anti bias framework and to start them in their circle practice. Teaching 2-year-olds how to even get into a circle and to sit and to pass a talking piece and to be able to relinquish it because it's so wonderful to hold and have everyone's eyes on you and give it to the next person, and to start to help them identify emotions and feelings, so that by the time they're 4, by the time they're 5, and by the time they get to kindergarten, holy smokes, they have already got some baseline for doing the work if I've got a kindergarten teacher who'll do it too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're building that world. We're building that world. You have been doing this work in CPS, but your community work hasn't stopped. Um,
Yeah,
what does that
I've
look
been
like?
very excited about this the last 4 years, I guess, 3 years, because I have never sought out this work. I never have. I did apply for the job at CPS after being asked to both times, invited to, but I've never sought it out. People just kind of hear about me, and there's so few people right now doing the work still that I'm like, well, sure, yeah, I'll talk to you. Let's see what this is about. And so I've been invited to work with community organizations who sometimes was initiated because harm had happened, and sometimes for other reasons. But I was pretty adamant that if if I'm going to be addressing harm, then we need to also be building some capacity to build
Mm-hmm.
relationships that are ongoing. So I was able. I've worked with 3 groups. One group in Evanston that was initially facilitated, not facil- but the process was an invitation from an older woman there, in the Ninth Ward. And I worked with the Edgewater Mutual Aid Organization and the 48th Ward Neighbors for Justice. And just started off doing, here's an overview. If you want more, let me know if you want more. And then identified people who really wanted to train up as circle keepers. And ended up with a core group of about 10 in each of those places, and with the idea that, okay, but when we're done, you have to commit to doing this work in your community. And That's happening. And so now, for instance, the Edgewater Mutual Aid Group have a monthly in person now. Now it's in person circle that happens in a local
Mm.
church where whoever they're inviting people to come and as a part of their mutual aid group are circling up outside when that's happening now that the weather's nice. And so that those kernels of and the excitement I hear from them about really what mutual aid is that they're getting and giving, that there's that it's a mutual process and also about really getting to know your neighbors and understanding who they all are and what we all bring to the space. So that to me is really, really important. That there are more people on the corners in these little pockets who understand what it's like to do relationship building circles and not just jump to this work when there's harm and they realize that they want to try to fix it but have no tools with which to do it.
Yeah, it's so resonant. As maybe this is a public service announcement to people who are listening to this and like maybe want to engage in restorative justice work at your
Mm,
organization with Amplify RJ. We don't
mm,
come in and fix your
mm,
shit, right? Um, we're happy to help you
mm,
like build that capacity to be in right relationship with each other and understanding that that takes time and guidance and support and sometimes that there are acute situations where y'all need support to take care of things
yeah.
with urgency. Happy to support that, but it can't come without the relationship building and the really embodying this because we're just cutting off like a we're addressing things like not at the source, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Things will continue to happen in this way if these practices aren't ingrained in. Like this applies to schools, this applies to community organizations, this applies to
yeah.
interpersonal relationships, which it's totally applicable. And you know, we've talked about all the ways that this has been in your professional life, in your like community work. how has quote unquote restorative justice impacted your personal life and the way that you show up in
Oh,
your relationships?
definitely. And that's a timeline too, So before I did the official training things or whatever, when I was
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
the work, or even when I was in Al-Anon, I started doing family circles when my kids were young, and so every Sunday we would sit in circle and pass a talking piece, and we would trade off who was leading. And sometimes it was very practical. What are we going to have for dinner this week? And have there be and going through everyone's schedules, but also hearing what was hard over the week and how we could help one another. That was very meaningful. And now that everybody's adults, I will tell you that all three of my kids are circle keepers in their different workspaces and in spaces that they go to, and that's been an important part of how they operate. And when things are hard, um, we try to circle up again together as a family. I also have a group of women who 6 years ago now I offered to do a grief circle for a group of people who I knew were experiencing a lot of emotional um, they whatever they were experiencing grief and loss, and so I didn't even know two of the people who came to that space, but it was so helpful that I'm like, y'all think you might want to do this again? And they're like, yeah, I think so. So we met 3 months later, and then we met again, and then we met again, and that was 6 years ago, and we are still meeting. COVID made us go virtual, but we are the best of friends and also help hold one another accountable when things come up, or to have, whether it's a text thread to say, okay, I messed up, or this is happening, help, I need some. So we try to do that for one another as well as being the support for one another. I have other groups. I mean, COVID allowed us to virtually, I know it helped, really helped you and your work, to really be in relationship with people I never would have had a chance. So I sit in a weekly virtual circle, weekly, Thursdays from 11 to 12, with some, mostly, well, administrators and people at the college level who have trained up in this work in some way, from outside of Chicago, and we sit in that circle together, and I have a biweekly circle I've been sitting in for 2 years. Um, that started during COVID too. That includes a couple people from Canada and other parts of the country. And I'm so looking forward to NACRJ conference. I'm leading the wellness committee for that conference, and I'm going to get to meet some people I've been sitting in circle with for 2 years and never met in person.
Yeah. Yeah, love it. And beautiful segue. Talk about NACRJ and the work that you're doing with the Wellness Committee. And just to plug for everyone, the NACRJ conference in Chicago, July 7th through 9th, pre-conference on
Yeah.
July 6th.
Yeah,
Okay,
so I'm
Jenny.
helping to chair the wellness committee, and our intention here was to have this is the first time Chicago's offering up a number of committees that haven't existed at any of the other conferences, and this is one of them. And so we just want to make sure that there's spaces, and of course, an art making space.
Mm-hmm.
For people to participate in a different kind of way, and to process whatever they're experiencing at the conference in a different kind of way. So we'll have an art making space, and a low sensory room. We're going to have a couple wellness carts that are going around, that just will provide some fidget toys and maybe a little Tylenol and some all kinds. It's going to be filled up with all the things your body might need while you're at the space. We're going to have practitioners who are there in between or very early in the morning prior to the conference starting, doing yoga, movement, acupuncture, maybe even some writing. And so that's all kind of ambiance to the conference things as they're going on. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very exciting. So, for those of you who have not signed up for the NACRJ conference, which I imagine as most of you listening to this podcast right now, there's a link in the description for you to do that. Sign up with the Amplify RJ group for the little group discount,
Yeah.
and get to meet Jenny in person as well. Before we finish our conversation with the questions everyone answers, if you've appreciated what you've heard and want to learn more about restorative justice, we have so many ways to help you out. Most easily, you can join our Mighty Networks community and take our free mini course, Restorative Justice. What's that? To get a solid grounding in how we in the Amplify RJ community conceptualize this work and apply it to our lives. We also have a rotation of other live and asynchronous learning opportunities on the courses tabs of the Mighty Networks community to help you go deeper. Finally, if you want to get in touch about bringing this work to your school, community, or organization, email us at info@amplifyrj.com to make it happen. Now, back to the episode. I want to transition to the question that the questions that everybody answers when they come on this podcast, in your own words, to find restorative justice.
Yeah. Well, for me, I do say that even outside of the schoolwork, I do like the idea of practice is better than justice, because I do equate a false sense of justice with our punitive system that we have. And so I like the idea that it's not just circle work. It's all the other work. It's my day-to-day work of walking my dog across Devon Avenue, which is a very busy street, and I used to curse people out who wouldn't let this old lady and her dog cross. And now I take a deep breath and I say, I wish you well. And so what are the day-to-day habits that I use in addition to circle practice to try to shift my response from a punitive response to a restorative one? So what it is to me, I think, is really being in right relationship, and also being in right relationship with myself. If I'm not feeling good about even what I'm thinking or doing or being, then I have to get in a right relationship with myself in order to be in right relationship with others.
Absolutely. As you've been doing this work, and you can describe this work in whatever ways feel resonant in the moment, what's been an oh shit moment, and what did you learn from it?
Well, I mean, so many. I'm so many. I mean, and I think I'm 60. I'm 62. I'm going to be 62. And sometimes I'm just like, oh my. And I guess it goes back to being in a right relationship. I think to myself, what an ass I was. What ego I had. How did I think I knew more? Or as a white woman, I'm always continuing to make mistakes and having to learn from it. And having to learn more about making the amends and doing that in the right way. And not causing more harm. With my own children, David, what does it mean to parent restoratively? That's been a big part of my work. How I parented then, as opposed to how I'm going to grandparent at some point. Oh my God, can you imagine what a brilliant grandma I'll be? It's the Oshits won't stop coming. It's what I choose to do with that information that makes a difference. Yeah.
You get to sit in circle with 4 people, living or dead. Who are they? And what is the one question you ask the circle?
Now I'll probably tear up. Because honestly, I'd have to make it 5, and it'd have to be my children. Because forever, those are going to be, I'm fidgeting here with my talking piece, which says it's family. That's my biggest value. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's who I always choose to be in circle with. And when we're all older, and I'm older, and being able to speak and listen from the heart with them is always going to be my go-to. And I guess my question will be the question I asked my father. I went and saw my dad and stepmom last week up north where I grew up. And without a talking piece, I still was able to ask a circle question and ask, what advice do you have? And hear that answer from my dad and stepmom. And I think I need to ask that question more often. and to ask it of my children and have them ask it of me. Because if we don't have a talking piece in our hands and the question isn't intentional, we're just not going to get to it. There's too much other stuff and business and work to be done and things to do. Yeah. Yeah. What advice do you have
When you say advice
for one
for you.
another?
Oh, gotcha. So, beautiful segue into another question that we ask. You have hundreds of people listening to your voice right now at different times, maybe potentially thousands in the future. But what
Oh, my
advice do you have
goodness.
for us?
Oh, well, I think a lot. I've done a lot of value circles, and I get to think all the time about what my values are. Um, and I think I most often come back to the value of bravery, of to be brave to speak your truth, and to be brave to speak when you've caused harm, um, and to embody bravery, in all its many facets.
I love that. And I just want to share like a little morsel for those who are longtime listeners of the podcast and those who listen in detail to every episode. You'll know that I recorded this podcast on the same day as I talked with Dorothy Burge, who's another wonderful practitioner in Chicago who will also be at the conference. But what was present for me, my team was facilitating a workshop around values this weekend, and so I posted on Instagram today a quote by Maya Angelou about, courage is the most important of all the virtues, because without courage you can't practice any other virtue consistently.
Great. Yeah.
And that's so present, and to be
Wow.
reminded of that twice, well, 3 times in one day, because I posted it and Dorothy and you, like, yeah. um Now I'm curious, like, dang, David, what do you have to be courageous about? What do you need to step up and be brave about? um Last 2 questions, and this one requires homework from you. Who's one person that I should have on the podcast,
Yeah.
and you have to help me get them on.
Well, you know, uh, I think it comes back to me saying that all of that idea about credentials and about who's doing the work and where the work lives and who's got a job doing it. And I do have a Facebook page I started this year, called All Things Restorative Chicago. And I try to post on that Facebook all the things that are happening. We're all siloed. We're so siloed. The abolitionist restorative people are siloed. The faith-based restorative people are siloed. The school-based people are siloed. The community. And so I want people to start talking more and recognizing that there are people all over this city doing it. And one of the new orgs that I want to lift up is Holding Space, which was founded by Ethan. Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
it's called Holding Space.
Holding Space.
Okay.
And their circles are called Stick Talk. And it was founded by Ethan Ucker and my Ethan. But there are 3 circles across this city happening every week where young men are showing up. And it's also a mutual aid organization, and it's pretty phenomenal. And one of the people who helps lead is Marlo English. You probably met Marlo at some point. He was at Circles and Ciphers for a long time. But Marlo has been doing this work since he was a teenager and is still out there in community doing the work. And I think hearing from him is a valuable thing, and a very different voice from mine. I don't know.
Beautiful. All things
Yeah.
all things restorative Chicago will be linked in the show notes, and I'm looking forward to that introductory email or
Yeah.
DM with Marlo. Finally, Jenny, how can people support you, your work, in the ways that
Oh,
you want to be
I
supported?
I am supported. My God. I am so lifted up by community. I feel so much love. I feel so much support. I, I really, really do. And I think just supporting me would mean learn more, do more, get out there, sit in circle with your family, sit in circle. And it doesn't have to be perfect, and you don't have to have it completely right. And often I'll say, who do you need to go make an amends to? Go do it now. And who do you need to ask an amends from? That's where the courage comes in too. Who do you need to say, hey, this was hurtful to me? Because when other people do it, it helps remind me that I need to continue to practice that too, that we're all modeling for one another.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Jenny, so much for sharing your stories across all of your experience and the wisdom that's come with that. I've learned a lot. Some things I didn't know about you before, and I'm sure lots of others have gathered things as well. Any other words you want to leave the people with?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for letting me talk. Normally, right, I don't get to say this absolute much.
Well, it was a pleasure having you. To everyone else, we'll be back with another conversation with someone living this restorative justice life next week. Until then, take care.
Elise here. Thanks, Jenny. I think it's so important that Jenny brings up the intersection between art and restorative justice. As an artist, she talks about the importance of art making and seeking opportunities relating to art and expressing how you belong in a space. She expressed that theater and being able to be on stage helped her feel like she was able to belong in a space. And I think finding ways to help others feel like they belong is such an important part of restorative justice. For me, that is theater and music as well. Where is one space where you feel like you can belong? Always belong. I hope there are multiple spaces that make you feel that way, but if not, what are ways that you can cultivate a safe space? Additionally, one of the really important points that Jenny brought up was the importance of bravery. Right at the end, she talked about to be brave to speak your truth and to be brave to say when you've caused harm is really important to restorative justice. When are you brave, and when are you the most brave? As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, rocking our new merch, joining our Patreon, or signing up for a workshop. So many options! Links to everything in the show notes and on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.